De clamor nacional e da greve geral contra a retirada de direitos, jamais apresentada nem a decisão da população pelo voto, contra esse governo ilegítimo.
Mientras el Senado vota por la reforma laboral de Temer, el Congreso discute la salida del presidente de facto por denuncias de corrupción pasiva. Grandes propietarios del campo y la ciudad, banqueros, dueños de oligopolios de la comunicación y empresarios aglutinados en la Federación de Industrias de Sao Paulo defienden las reformas de ajuste económico, sin importar quién las implemente.
Good evening and welcome to the world today. Tonight we're going to discuss the situation in Brazil, which deteriorates with every passing day, every passing week, as the government that organized a constitutional coup to remove President Dilma Rousseff of the PT from power stumbles, trips, falls, and is defended by the Brazilian establishment without any shame. What Dilma Rousseff was accused of did not apply to her. She was accused of being in charge of the country when certain acts, corrupt acts, took place. Effectively, there was nothing against her personally. With her successor, currently the favorite of the financial magazines, or not currently, some weeks ago, the favorite, people were heaving a sigh of relief in The Economist and the Financial Times that at last we can do business again, for the good news for the West. This guy has been captured on a tape recording offering a bribe himself. That is the situation confronting the president of Brazil. His name is Temer. I don't particularly like saying it because it gives you a funny feeling. That this is a guy who has succeeded in getting rid of an elected president, is persecuting one of the iconic presidents of the country, the former President Lula. His own ratings are now on 10 or 11%. He is widely disliked and hated, and it's all happened very soon. So once again, to discuss Brazil, we have a guest, a different guest. This is Professor Alfredo Saad Filho, Professor of Political Economy at SOAS in London, one of the most distinguished international colleges in the world, where he has been teaching now for some years. Alfredo, welcome.
Thank you, Tariq.
Tell me, let's start just with the present. Describe for us what is going on now in Brazil.
Brazil is going through the most severe economic contraction in recorded history, and at the same time, the most serious political crisis in living memory. It is a country under tremendous stress, economic, political, and social. This is partly because of economic difficulties that have radiated from the global economic crisis starting already almost 10 years ago, and that have affected middle-income countries very badly. But Brazil has been particularly affected by a political impasse, a rebellion of the elites that absolutely rejected President Dilma Rousseff, absolutely rejected the PT, and saw an opportunity to attack and to remove Dilma Rousseff from office when her difficulties, political and economic difficulties, started to mount. This rebellion has been successful, but the problems, as you mentioned, of the current administration are many, and they are not going away. So President Temer is finding it extremely difficult to stabilize the ship of state, but more than that, to guarantee his own survival in office and to keep himself out of prison. This is his most immediate challenge.
Do you think he's going to succeed, Alfredo?
At the moment, it looks likely that he will succeed. There are difficulties in his way. The Attorney General's office has sent to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court immediately to Congress, a case against President Temer for corruption. Now, this case has to be judged by Congress. It failed in the Congressional Committee that was going to give a preliminary assessment of the situation, but it doesn't change anything. A vote for yes or no doesn't change. The case has to go to the Chamber of Deputies, where it needs 2/3 of the deputies to vote.
That's about 340?
About 340. Now, if the opposition were to be able to get that number of deputies, President Temer would be removed from office. It looks unlikely now. But the Attorney General's office has got apparently 3 more cases to launch. And the plan was to launch them one by one to erode Temer's possibilities of survival. His difficulty is this. He needs to buy support from the deputies every single time. So if the Attorney General sends 4 cases, Temer has to spend 4 times as much money as for one single case. Now, he has apparently bought his way out, and I use these words advisedly, bought his way out of the first case that will be judged by the Chamber of Deputies on the 2nd of August. There are more cases to come. Now, the Attorney General himself, Brazil is unbelievable at the moment. The Attorney General's term of office ends in September, so he might not have time to fulfill his plan of sending the cases one by one. He may have to bundle them up. If he bundles them up, they become more powerful, but at the same time, for Temer is just one set of purchases of support that he has to make. It is difficult, but possible. Also, Congress goes into its holidays very soon, and Temer gains time. 2018 is the year of elections. Potential candidates are already positioning themselves. So it is possible that Temer will stay in office, but as a completely powerless president.
And as a despised figure, despised by many on his own side, despised certainly by the opposition, and despised by the ordinary people.
Yeah, absolutely. He's the most unpopular president in recorded history in Brazil. He has nothing to show for himself except survival. But for one thing, he has managed to implement the program of the coup. And the program of the coup was, first of all, change the oil exploration law to weaken Petrobras, the state oil company, and allow transnational companies to exploit oil in Brazil. They've done that. They have also changed labor law. Labor law in Brazil comes from the populist democracy period of the 1940s, 50s dictatorship and democracy of the 1940s, initially from Vargas and then changed over time. It has been essentially revoked, essentially abolished, to the point that the ILO and trade unions complain that current labor law essentially legalizes slavery. It is possible to have slaves in Brazil today in legal terms because the workers have been left bereft of almost any form of protection. And the government has a third commitment, which is a change in social security law and pensions to restrict pensions and cut the rights of workers. On this, the coup is absolutely united, the media is united, and Parliament is in a massive majority implementing those reforms. Outside of this plan for the coup, nothing works for Temer. He can't get anything else done.
But they've got these important things through. They are big concessions, of course.
They are
huge
massive achievements for the coup. This is what they wanted to achieve by removing Dilma Rousseff and the PT from office. And they are doing it.
And where is the opposition coming from? The PT itself, let's discuss it for a moment, Alfredo, appeared quite a weakened force, weakened by years of power, weakened by being taken by surprise, unable to deal with the early period of the student unrest, not the later one. And when Dilma was removed, there were, of course, a few demonstrations. I saw that, but not the size of these wasn't that huge. And when that happens to a government, a progressive government, then you feel this is going to pose a huge problem. So even the fact that Temer has proved to be a disaster is not sufficient to turn things round immediately. The laws that they have been passed, I mean, these are horrendous laws. According to any reckoning, no other government would get away with them in most parts of the world. Has there been any opposition from the powerful trade unions, which once certainly existed and were there on behalf of the workforces?
There has been some reaction, but it has fizzled out. There was the largest general strike in Brazilian history on the 28th of April. Approximately 35 million workers went on strike. This was followed by another strike towards the end of June that was much, much smaller. So Brazil lives through, at the moment, a political impasse, but it's not because both sides are equally strong, it's because both sides are equally weak. And you have this vacuum developing at the core of power. Now, the Brazilian left is paralyzed for several reasons. One of them is the inheritance of the PT. The PT itself is divided about its achievements in office, and the other parts of the left outside the PT are divided about how to assess the years of the PT. And this has been making it extremely difficult to mount a defense of legality, a defense of the Constitution, and evidently a defense of President Rousseff, who was unjustly, unfairly, illegally removed from office by a coup, a civilian judicial congressional coup d'etat. Now, the PT at the moment is still extremely weak. It has been demoralized by its years in power. It has achieved power, if you go back a decade and a half, by demobilizing its own social base. That was the pact, the implicit pact that the PT made with the Brazilian elite to keep people off the street and do conventional politics as a condition for power. They did that, and now they've been removed from power, and they find themselves without a mass base of support. Now, in addition to this, many people in Brazil are simply frightened of the economic crisis. Unemployment has gone up from 4% under Dilma at the beginning of the second administration of Dilma Rousseff in 2014 to about 14–15% now. The economy has only now stopped contracting, but GDP per capita is back to what it was 10–12 years ago. The country has lost more than a decade with the current economic crisis. So it's been very difficult to mobilize under these circumstances, both political difficulties within the left and economic difficulties affecting millions of people.
And Alfredo, what is the basis of the charges against former President Lula? What are they accusing him of?
There has been a determination at the highest level.
To destroy him.
To destroy him, absolutely. To prevent him from running for president again, ever. Now, when Lula, just to put this into context, when Lula stepped down from office at the end of 2010, he was the most popular politician in Brazilian history. His approval ratings were about 90%. Now, today, in the opinion polls, despite years of relentless daily attacks by the media, Lula has about 30% support in the opinion polls. He is the most popular politician in the country still. The political right, surprisingly, they're able to mount a coup and remove a president from office, but they do not have a viable presidential candidate. This is incredible. There is a political impasse within the right wing as well. Now, Lula has been accused of many things over the years, but what the judge Sergio Moro, who's been leading the charge, has zoomed into is a flat that apparently the accusation is Lula would have received as a bribe in exchange for favors for construction companies connected to the Petrobras scandal. Now, this is a very peculiar case. And if you read the summary of the sentence, it's about 260 pages long. There is no proof there. There are allusions and impressions, and the only substantive piece of evidence is a story that came out in a newspaper back in 2010 that Lula would have received this flat. Now, the flat does not belong to him. It does not belong to anyone in his family. The flat belongs to a construction company, and it is impounded by a state-owned bank. The flat cannot be used or sold. It is part of the patrimony of a construction company in difficulties with this state-owned bank. It is absurd to even to suggest that Lula owns that place, that he has visited once when they were thinking, Lula and his wife were thinking of buying the flat almost 10 years ago. Now, this has served as the pretext to persecute this man, to sentence him to 9.5 years in jail, to confiscate his bank accounts and his private pensions even. This is a former president of the Republic accused on the basis of nothing at all. Now, I have all sorts of political commentary to make about Lula, both for and against Lula. But this is a violation of the constitutional rights of presumption of innocence. And it is a violation of any notion of justice to sentence somebody on that basis.
Does he have any legal recourse left on this case?
He can continue to appeal, but there is a paradox in Brazilian law. When the corruption scandal started coming in a few years ago, it was noticed that politicians, being relatively privileged and well-resourced people, could appeal all the way to the Supreme Court, and this would take years. Brazilian justice is extraordinarily inefficient. In the meantime, they'll just carry on their lives as normal. So a law was passed saying that if somebody is sentenced in the first instance, appeals and loses, that person becomes immediately unable to run for elections again, even if the remaining appeals are still pending. So here you are, you have passed a law that sentences someone before all the appeal opportunities have been exhausted, which is legally very questionable. Now, the challenge for the coup is Lula has already lost the first instance. Now he appeals, he is going probably to lose the second instance. He becomes ineligible. There's only one possibility of appeal directly to the Supreme Court to request that he may be allowed to continue to run for the elections while the case is finally pending. It's not clear that he will succeed. The challenge for the coup is to find a way to keep Lula out of the elections. The challenge for Lula himself and for the PT is to keep Lula running. This is, again, a problem for the Brazilian left. If you think about it from a broader perspective, Lula is clearly the only viable candidate on the left at the moment, but this is partly because everybody else has been neutralized by Lula, by the PT, by the obsession with keeping the social peace in the country, agreements with a big capital. Now we find ourselves in this situation of having very few options available for the left as a whole. And Lula has already served. He has done the job. He should not be called upon to do it again.
But this is a sign of the big weakness of the PT leadership during its period in power, Alfredo, surely, that they could not develop a team, create younger cadres, give people a chance. Everything was controlled rigidly from the top. And relations with the MST, for instance, were bad certainly for the early years. I mean, not as bad as they are under the right, but they were not good, because the MST, the Landless Peasants Movement, has produced a group of leaders who I was very impressed with when I went to speak at their cadre school in Sao Paulo some years ago. They were being educated, they were being encouraged to ask questions, to be critical, etc., etc. So and within the PT itself and on the left of the PT, a whole bunch of intellectuals of a very high caliber, in my opinion, higher than most parts of Europe today, if one is looking at the Brazilian intelligentsia. So none of this need have been sidelined.
This is correct. Lula, in practice, operated like this gigantic tree that lets nothing else grow in its vicinity. It's a massive personality, much bigger than the PT itself, and cultivated in this way. So this whole generation of other leaders that grew inside the PT together with Lula since the party was founded at the beginning of the late 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, they're gone. Where are all these people? And they were the alternative, the future leaders of the party. They're not there anymore. The PT does have a serious problem of lack of leadership.
And there's no other national organization to match it at all?
Absolutely not, no. Nothing has prospered in Brazil to the left of the PT. The trade unions connected to the PT have become very, very focused on economic concerns and very, very lightweight in political terms. So the PT finds itself at its hour of need, unable to connect to civil society, unable to mobilize masses of workers that the party itself defended. Now, we cannot forget the social, economic, distributional gains during the PT administrations. Where are the beneficiaries now? Why are they not immediately fighting? Well, immediately fighting to preserve the administration of Dilma Rousseff, but now fighting against this administration of Michel Temer. That is an absolute disgrace for the country. They are not there.
I think the demoralization was becoming visible even during the PT's years in power. Every time I went, I would meet people from the PT on its fringes who would complain, saying, okay, I mean, even on the Bolsa Familia, the grant basically given to the poorest of the poor. No one objected to it on the left, of course, but they said that it's like charity. It's important, it's very good, we should never stop it. It's not enough. You need structural changes, you know, on a social level, which Brazil can afford. Which the government isn't pushing through because they are trapped by their economic policies in the neoliberal framework. For the first term at least, he didn't move out of that at all. And Pelosi and all his other advisors said, stay in, the banks are crucial. I mean, there was a time when even Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the former president, I mean, of course, being mischievous, said Lula is behaving too much like me and too little like himself. It was difficult to disagree. So this has been a big problem. I mean, if Lula is kept, he's not in prison at the moment, he's on bail.
Yes.
Yeah. But clearly the aim is to stop him ever running again as president of Brazil. That's the aim. So in that case, if they succeed, which looks likely, who is going to be the candidate for the PT? Or an opposition candidate to take on these corrupt politicians?
This will be extremely difficult. Ciro Gomes from the Democratic Labour Party has been positioning himself on the left, and he has been a consistent supporter of Dilma Rousseff and of Lula himself. But he is an erratic political figure. Very recently, during the past week, he suddenly decided to start criticizing Lula and Dilma Rousseff. He had committed not to run as a candidate for the presidency if Lula was running. Now he's saying that he will run anyway. But this seems to be the only national personality broadly on the left who may be in a position to run a successful campaign. This is a shame. There may be other candidates emerging over time, but no one with anything like the charisma of Lula, the national appeal, the capacity to mobilize masses of people, the capacity to establish this direct connection with the poor in Brazil. And Lula can do this. He has done this all his life. He is a poor person from a poor background. And he has the vocabulary and the political talent. This is a very rare combination of virtues, and they've consolidated in this individual who has certainly transformed the history of Brazil. But at a personal level, he's in an extremely difficult and precarious position. He is now finally going on the offensive, though. Lula has started a tour of the Brazilian Northeast. The Northeast is the poorest region in Brazil, the region that has benefited the most from the administrations of the PT. The Northeast has grown much faster than the average. The Northeast has industrialized, etc. So Lula has started his political tour from the Northeast.
And people are coming?
People are coming, and he has enormous prestige in the whole area still. But if Lula were to be able to run and were to win the election, and these are big ifs, he would find it extremely difficult to assemble a coalition allowing him to govern. The Brazilian political system is very perverse. The president, like in the French system, is elected directly by the people in 2 rounds. So when you are elected, you have enormous personal popularity and support. But Congress is elected under a proportional system that favors the multiplication of political parties. So at the moment you have 28 political parties represented in Congress, and traditionally no party ever wins more than 20% of seats.
So money becomes important to buy them.
Absolutely. You need coalitions. Congress is very powerful. It is impossible to govern without coalitions. The only way to assemble the coalitions is by buying support. So you distribute positions in government with the understanding that you're not just inviting a political leader to take up a ministry, you're also giving them access to the resources and the freedom to spend those resources. One of the problems that Dilma Rousseff had was that she was excessively careful with public spending. So she would not allow ministers and their underlings to spend money freely. That broke, it was one of the main reasons why her coalition broke. Politicians in Brazil demand access and expect to be able to use public funds.
And give jobs to their friends, families, clear.
Of course.
That goes without saying.
Yes, this is how the system works. You do not do that, you cannot have a working coalition, you will be removed from power. Now, for Lula at the moment, this is a problem. Very few political parties will want to have a coalition with him.
So you would have, if he were allowed to run, if he were elected, he would be isolated very rapidly. Very rapidly.
The entirety of a capital, both transnationalized and domestic capital, are firmly positioned against the PT. The upper middle class is not just against the PT in general, but rabidly against the PT. So influential professions, the entire judicial system, the federal police, they're all positioned against the party. Lula will find it very difficult to put together a working government.
Alfredo, there is something supremely ironic here. That 20 years ago, or so, thereabouts, when the 2 models were springing up in South America, the Venezuelan model with the Bolivarians, and the PT model, more orthodox, the entire media, global media networks, especially the financial press, The Economist, actually waged a campaign saying Latin America is turbulent, there are 2 models, there are alternative models, don't go in the direction of the Bolivarians, there are extremists, etc. The sane, sober model is that of Lula in Brazil. That is what we should be backing. They wrote this black and white, and today they've completely abandoned even that.
Completely abandoned, that's correct. It was a problem of relations of forces. Lula, when coming to his first election in 2002, committed his government to respecting neoliberalism, to maintaining the neoliberal economic policy framework, and maintaining an agreement with the International Monetary Fund that had been signed just previously by President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. In doing this, Lula essentially bought a truce with capital, and he fulfilled his side of the bargain for many years. Over time, with his growing popularity and the degrees of freedom that came from the global commodity boom and economic success, then Lula became a little bit more bold and implemented bolder distributional programs and a more nationalist economic policy and a more nationalist foreign policy. He could get away with it because of his political talents and because of economic prosperity in the country until 2010. Dilma Rousseff came into power in 2011, exactly when the economic situation was turning, and she was unable to stabilize the economy. She was unable to stabilize the political system and ended up losing all possible sources of support. That was the tragedy of Brazil since 2012 approximately, when things started slipping from Dilma Rousseff's hand.
Alfredo, we shall see how that tragedy proceeds or whether it can be overcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Tariq.